You are listening to the EP podcast. Note that some of our episodes also air as Words on a Wire on KTEP 88.5 FM, your NPR station for the Southwest. Be sure to support your local public radio stations for all of the great work they do. Now, enjoy this episode with host William Rose.
And I read a story by Carver, and then I wrote a story by my version, which was a story called Down in the West Texas Town. It's about junkies in El Paso, these junkie construction carpenters, and they're essentially guys I worked with. And so anyway, I gave it to Carver, and I said, can we talk? I didn't know people took classes in creative writing. I had no idea what he was doing there. And I assumed that he'd have a class of like 4 or 5 people. I had no clue. And he said, come meet me. And it turned out there's like too many people wanted to be in his class, which was a total revelation to me. So anyway, but he still saw me, which is kind, generous.
That was legendary writer Dagoberto Gilb talking about the time he encountered another legendary writer, Raymond Carver, back when Carver was a visiting professor at UTEP. My name is Will Rose, and today's episode of Words on the Wire is a special one for me. Dagoberto Gilb is one of my all-time favorite authors, and he's joining us today to talk about the release of 2 new books, a short story collection called New Testaments, and an essay collection called A Passing West. Stick around for a great conversation.
Words on a Wire.
Words on a Wire.
So you just had 2 books come out at the same time. I wanted to ask you about that. I don't think I've seen that too often. How did that come about?
So I spent some time. I had one book in 2012, and then I was working on a novel, which is still it's still going to happen. My big novel. And, but it's hard. It's hard. The practical things of life, working one-handed and stuff. So anyway, meanwhile, I was working on this novel and realized that it might take me 3 or 4 years. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know if I should wait that long. You need a book every few years. So I decided, okay, I'm going to go back. I published a couple stories and I decided to do stories. Okay, I'll just do that and keep going. So that's what happened when New Testaments came out. I did that. Meanwhile, I had some essays that I since Gritos, which, did well, actually. For an essay collection, it did well. For a Chicano essay collection, it did well. It doesn't mean it, in New York, well, that's not, anyway, that's another subject. So anyway, finally, when I got this New Testaments, I just tried, I knew New York wouldn't want it. New York doesn't want essays unless they're by a major one of theirs. And then I went to my backyard, to my neighborhood publisher, which was New Mexico. And they wanted it. Not only they wanted it, they loved to get it. And so it was exciting. And they decided to put them together. Thought it would be a good promotional, good to work together. We'll see how that works out. It's just beginning. Both books came out a week ago. And so we're seeing how it goes. The world of publishing is so different. I was so spoiled the previous 20 years. My book won a prize in 93, 94. And then, I got picked up by Grove Press in New York City. And, I was always in the premier class where I would get sent places. And but as time goes on and the book business shrinks as everything with intelligence in it seems to shrink, Yeah, books aren't big, and we're less than that now. New York, they don't even know what a Chicano is anymore. They don't know when they say Latino, they're meaning Dominican and Puerto Rican and not Mexican American at all. They don't. They think we're basically Mexicanos were part of an invasion force. So unless you're writing a book like that, they're not. They weren't excited about my New Testaments, and so finally, what I did is said, I'm sick of this New York thing. Why do they get to decide what is being Mexican American, being Latino? I love Juno Diaz, but why would you ask Juno Diaz what the best tacos in LA would be?
Right.
I mean, what are you doing that for? And so they don't distinguish. You think El Paso, they think it's a nice border crossing, but they don't know anything about the people who live in El Paso. They don't have a clue.
Right, exactly. Well, speaking of El Paso, I love how prominent El Paso and the Borderlands are in your work, including in both of these new books. So I wanted to ask you about an interesting story that took place in El Paso, which you wrote about in your essay, A Little Bit of Fun Before He Died. I love this so much. So tell us about how you and a man named Bill Ripley were writing a poem in a coffee shop right here in El Paso on Mesa Street that ended up inspiring one of the biggest pop music hits of the 1990s. So tell us about Bill Ripley.
Bill Ripley was this big guy. I always hang out with big guys, not just a thing, next thing I knew, this guy, he always wanted to go get a toddy. I didn't even know what a toddy was. I never heard of a toddy. Wasn't a whiskey guy. It wasn't my style. And this guy, he was the first writer I ever met. I never met another guy, another woman, nobody that was ever published or did writing, let alone and not only did he publish in Harvard, he was a student and graduated from Harvard. So he was like a unique personality to me. Totally. Now, why was he at UTEP? This is important because he was a huge drug dealer. He would sell coke pretty widely, but he was also well connected, something we're never connected. We're connected. We're going to go, man. That's our connect to the jailhouse is our connection. We're guilty mostly right away. But his dad was a congressman. I guess it was his stepdad, but even then, my stepdad would be the first one to put me in jail. But his cared for him. And his parole, and I'm serious, his parole was to go to UTEP.
That's
and
interesting.
I thought, oh my God, what is that? Ripley had a was it a Chevy pickup? I'm forgetting now. He'd like drive 80, 90 on Mesa, and I'd like, oh God, man, I can't do this. And that's what the story is about, all that stuff. And by the time 10 years pass, I think, and Ripley somehow, again, I don't have a degree. Even then, I didn't last at UTEP because I didn't have a degree in English. They thought I did. And I'm not saying I don't. I didn't say I did, but I didn't tell them I don't either. And then they sort of like asked me to leave. And so I left. But he, in fact, did. He's from Harvard, no less. And he got his next move up and to go get a PhD at Utah in creative writing, which, in fact, he wrote a book. Absolutely impossible for him to sustain because he's more like a prose poet. absolutely the most hilarious, ridiculous things he would tell you. I mean, I can't tell you the stories because there's not one that isn't profane. Anyway, he ended up in Austin and he became a junkie. So I went and visited him and he was telling me, oh, Dagoberto, that they're trying, this guy ripped me off, because he would say, Dagoberto, all I'm trying to do is have a little bit of fun before I die. Is that wrong? Is there anything wrong with a guy wanting a little bit of fun before he dies? And I'd say, you know what, Ripley, I think it's not dumb. I don't know, but if I were you, I'd say that's okay. And that was Ripley. Well, he was pretty gone. And the last I saw him, so what happened to that little phrase of his, we wrote a poem at that coffee shop. I wish I had the copy of the poem. It was for a graduate class. The poet was named Philip Dow. He had that guy, Philip Dow, who was, I guess, a reputable poet. I didn't know. I had no idea. I didn't know poets. And we had, for his homework, we had to write a poem. So we go to that place. Of course, we were a little, toked up, drank up a little bit. And we're in the coffee shop drinking coffee. and me and Ripley decided we'd write his poem due for class that evening. It was always an evening class because it's a graduate class. And it became a little bit of fun. And the criteria was he'd write a line, and if I cracked up, it was a keeper. And it was only like 12 to 15 lines. And we laughed like maniacs. It was all about, here we are sitting in a little cafe in El Paso on a real hot day doing nothing. And, that was funny. It's like, yeah, that's so ridiculous. We're writing poetry in the middle of the afternoon. How ridiculous is that? But it went like that. And yeah, and then, but time passed. He goes to UTEP. I guess I don't know, but he maybe showed the poem, and it was a story he would tell. And there was a poet there who heard it, and he wrote a poem based on Ripley's poem. It's a version of the poem that he wrote. And so then it got published in a book, long story there. And so then next thing you know, Sheryl Crow's manager was desperate for her to write something. And so the manager went to used bookstores in LA and bought a bunch of poetry books, let's just say 10. And in the book was this one by the guy's name who I won't say because he got really upset that I ever wrote this piece. and Ripley accused him of things like stealing his material. And I had no involvement with any of that. I'm just recounting the story. So I won't say his name. But she got that poem, and she said instead of it being El Paso, it became Santa Monica. And that's the story I write, recounting how this poem we rewrote laughing hysterically in El Paso, hanging out and being, ridiculous poets. He'd actually call me a poet. He didn't, even though he wasn't a poet either. So anyway, it was fun and actually a good piece. It got picked for a Best American not short story,
wow.
Best American essay.
Wow. That is such a cool story. I love it.
It is a cool story. I got to be in it too.
I wanted to ask you something else about your time at UTEP. I actually didn't know this until I read his biography a while back, but very famous short story writer Raymond Carver actually taught at UTEP for a year. And one of the well-known stories about you is that you met Carver during his time there, and he actually made you an offer to study at the University of Iowa, which you declined. Just for our listeners, the Writers' Workshop at Iowa is by far the most prestigious creative writing program in the country. So can you talk a little bit about your encounter with Raymond Carver at UTEP?
Let me just set up how my relationship with Carver got to be. I'm writing a novel, actually, which was horrible, but I didn't think that. I thought it was really, really good, and I was going to be rich and famous. But I was halfway through it, and that's kind of why I got to be a teacher, because they liked that I was writing a book. That was a guy named Les Standiford, who was the chair of UTEP at the time. He let me teach because I had half a manuscript for a novel. He didn't read it. Although I did read it at UTEP, and I met a bunch of people who liked it. So anyway, it didn't work out. So I learned stories, and I read a story by Carver, and then I wrote a story by my version, which was a story called Down in the West Texas Town. It's about junkies in El Paso, these junkie construction carpenters and they're essentially guys I worked with. And so anyway, I gave it to Carver and I said, "Can we talk?" I didn't know people took classes in creative writing. I had no idea what he was doing there. And I assumed that he'd have a class of like 4 or 5 people. I had no clue. And he said, "Come meet me." And it turned out there's like too many people wanted to be in his class, which was a total revelation to me. So anyway, but he still saw me, which is kind, generous. And, I go in and he had circled 2 words on my story. One, I think, was rapaciously. He said, and he was right. I shouldn't have had that word in there. And the other one, I think, it is funny, and I'm going to say it because I mean it as funny. I think I put fart as something. I don't know if somebody farted or I don't know what I put it in there. It's there in the story. It's still, I think, because it got reprinted for a while. And he said, "You don't use that word." And and then he offered a recommendation to go to Iowa to the writer's school, right? Of course, at that time, I didn't even know what the hell that was. I mean, none. I had no idea. Why would I go to Iowa? And, when I was in college, I tutored Native Americans and Chicanos in English because long story there too. How I ever got that gig is another story in college. But anyway, I tutored. And so I was also into buying. I love cowboy, but the specific cowboy novel I loved were with Indians in it. And I loved the main character to be a half-breed because that's how I saw myself. I'm a half-breed. And I loved, that was a character I focused in on, half-breed Indians who were, too messed up for Indians and too messed up for white people and everybody. It was always a good character to me. And so I had a good collection. I wish I still had that, but and you're flaky like me. I had a collection for that long and then it's gone. Anyway, so when he says Iowa, I think about Kiowa. So anyway, I had a little Kiowa thing. So I kept thinking Kiowa. And when he was saying Iowa, I was going Kiowa. So I didn't go to Iowa, though. That was it.
Oh, wow. There's one other essay in A Passing West that I wanted to talk to you about, the one called Snow Angel, so this essay takes place during the big winter storm that gripped parts of Texas back in 2021. I also happened to be there in Austin when that happened. Right before then, my wife and I were living in New York City through that first year of COVID. And like a lot of other people in New York at that time, we decided to leave the city and made a decision to move to Austin. So I lived in Austin before, so it made sense. And plus I worked in tech and it's, a big tech town. Anyways, that first evening we arrived in Austin was right at the start of that winter storm. We spent our first week there in Austin without working water or electricity. So I'd spent the previous 5 winters in New York City. So I thought I understood the cold, but nothing prepared me for that first week in Austin. No working heat or even a way to buy groceries. It was terrible. So I feel like we had a shared experience when I read the essay, although your circumstances, to be clear, were a bit more serious than mine. Can you talk a little bit about Snow Angel?
That story for me, it was 90% disability. It's like I'm disabled, but, I used to not be disabled. And so a lot of times I have to recognize, oh my God, I can't do that. And it's a little hard for me because, as a kid, I was always the guy that picked, I'm the picker. I pick guys and, I'm 1 or 2 in the athletic thing. And I was always good at stuff. And now I'm one-handed and fragile. Like this is me being a guy and a male and kind of a big guy. I'm used to dealing with big guys and issues, at least as a young man, like you come after, you say something to me, I say something to you. But, an 8-year-old could push me and I'm on the ground. And like, oh my God, I don't know what I'll do here. I can blow all I want with my mouth, but an 8-year-old pushes me, not even in the right place, and I'm going to lose my balance. And so when this happened, I was in, I have a nice little house, and, I like my house quite a bit. I wish I could take it to Mexico City and live in it there. But here I am, and I'm alone. And then it happens, I have, food issue. I think the food I could have dealt with, but I had trouble lighting matches. I can't even do that easily. One-handed lighting matches, which I don't have enough of, and all these things. So I knew that the outlook was, and you read the story, they were not sure it wouldn't be like 7 days. And I lived in Wyoming. That was my first real, snowbound city where, everything is, 6 to 10 inches of snow everywhere you go, and walking and driving and everything in Wyoming. I taught there a semester, and I lived there, and of course then I could walk. It wasn't like I couldn't do things, but what I knew is I couldn't step outside my house and walk across the street without falling. I knew I would fall. There's no question. And then the question would, if I fall, who will see me? And you'd see nobody. As far as you could tell, everything is abandoned. And I mean, step out my door. I have tiles in the front of my door. It's like you step on that tile and you're down. If you step wrong, you slide. Everyone slides. And concrete. And I live in it's not hilly and by any means, but it's for Austin, it's kind of hilly. And so I have to climb up and climb, it's all. So I realized that I might not do this very well. I mean, aside from being alone and having all these struggles and, potentially blowing myself up by accident because I do something wrong with my right hand doesn't help me. So I started looking up, I'll just go to any hotel I can get to. And there are no Ubers. There are no Ubers. Nobody. I called people, and that was a secondary problem. I'm not going to have a phone in a minute. It's like I got this much time for phone calls, and no way to charge it. So it's like okay, you got to make the right phone call, and it lasts just this amount of time. There was one additional thing. I got a neighbor who helped me, but except he had COVID. It was one of those like, okay, you have COVID. So anyway, the story is that an angel came. I got an Uber guy who, my own feeling was, it's not in the story, is that he wasn't hearing all the horrible stuff. He was deaf. So you were supposed to be on the road. He's the only Uber driver in Uber on the road. He picked me up. He picked up my request for a ride, and he started coming. And, there are two major routes into my house. And first he picked this one, which not because of the snow, but because of construction was blocked off at some point. It was like, you can't go any further. You can't, it's not very far. Normally it would just be like a half a block, 3/4 of a block to walk to. I can't walk. And I wouldn't make it. There was no question in my mind, especially when you can't see what you're walking into. You don't know when you're going to step on something that trips you. It's everything pointed to me not making it. So at some point he gets to song, I can't do it. He writes to me, I can't come. I said, here, just one more thing, one more try, do this. I told him it was up a graded hill. It's the other way into my house. It's not any kind of serious hill, except with snow on it. I didn't know, but anyway, he made it. He made it to my house. My house has a slope, maybe like 10 degrees. You go down from the driveway. He gets in like, I just wanted to kiss the sky. I'm like, oh my God, you saved my life. Of course, I can't say this. He can't hear me say this. He's deaf. And he's a big guy. I like that. He's kind of 6'3", not a little guy. And at some point, he's trying to get out, and he can't get out of my driveway because of the snow. And I'm like, oh my God, now he and I are going to be here for 5 to 7 days, 7, maybe 9. They weren't sure. I called everybody I could. Nobody knew. Of course, she also didn't get news, no TV. I couldn't do anything. So, but finally, we both kind of worked together. I gave him shovels. I gave him everything I could do. We got out. He drove me to a hotel, and there I was. And the dude, you don't even know you're saying goodbye. It's like, thank you. And he's, I guess he got it, but it's just something, a deaf guy, a disabled man, and me, and oh my God, that's a story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting, however, there's also these publishing stories, which is also interesting. Yeah, nobody wanted that story.
Yeah, that's too bad. That's one of my favorite essays.
It gets curious why they will publish some things and not others, and what is the deal? Anyway, thank you for liking. I wish I had more stories of being disabled. Actually, I was proud of that one.
Well, thank you so much, Dagoberto, for joining me today. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Will. Thank you for your patience with me, too.
Thank you for listening to Words on a Wire on KTEP 88.5 FM, your NPR station for the Southwest. Be sure to catch more episodes of our 16th season every Sunday at noon.
Madrecita, no sé yo. Abuelita, no sé.